Today, I'm going to be building a dozen perfect arrows. I'm going to show you all of the steps that I take to build the most consistent and the most accurate arrows for any setup. By following these principles, you can get the most out of your arrows regardless of the brand that you shoot. So the first step that I'm going to do is I'm going to check each of these arrows for straightness. So I'm just going to take a simple arrow spinner and I will take all my arrows out here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll each arrow on the spinner, and I'm going to identify which end has the most wobble in it. What I'm going to do is cut actually from each end of the shaft to try to get the straightness down so that the straightness variance is much less. So if I just take this first arrow and I put it on this spinner and I spin it, I can tell that this end has very, very little wobble, but this nock end has more. Okay, so this is a roughly 32 3/4 inch full length shaft. My personal arrows are going to be cut 27.5 inches. So when I cut from both sides, I'm going to want to take a little bit more from the end that has a little bit more wobble in it. So I'm just going to take my marker and I'm going to mark on this end here with the wobble on the shaft. That way I know that I need to cut from this end first. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to do this for all these arrows, then I'm going to cut roughly 3 inches off of that end of the shaft. So now that I have the wobbly end of each arrow marked, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out each nock on both ends and I'm going to cut, say, roughly 2 to 3 inches off of it from that full length shaft. So I'm going to set it, I'll just set it to 29.5. I'll cut carbon to carbon, just cut the wobbliest end first, and then what I'll do is I'll put the nock back in on that side that I cut, flip the arrows around, set the saw to 27.5 inches. That way that's my final arrow length, and I'll cut from the other end. So they're all the same length, but they've got the least amount of straightness variance within each shaft. So to remove the nocks, I just take a pair of pliers and I just lightly squeeze the nock and just kind of twist it right off of the shaft. You got to be pretty gentle with it because the nocks are plastic, so you can bend these or potentially break them if you're not careful. So you want to be very careful when you take these off. So now that we've got all the nocks out, I'm just going to verify that all the ends up here are all the marked wobbly ends, which it looks like every one is. So that is the end we're going to be cutting from, because that is the most wobbly end on the arrow for each arrow. So if you want to come around here, I'm just going to adjust this so that it's roughly, we'll probably call it, let's just do 29 inches for this first cut, 29.5. So the saw is set at 29.5 right here. This is going to be for our first cut, because remember, we're going to end up at 27.5. So before I cut, always put on safety glasses. You do not want that carbon getting in your eyes. Okay. And I'll turn on my saw. You're not forcing the arrow into the saw blade. You're setting it against it and just spinning it all the way around the shaft so you've got a nice clean cut. So now that I've made the first cut, I cut from this end. This is the end that all the nocks are going to go into. So I'm just going to put all the nocks in at this time before I make the cut on the other side of the arrows. That way I know the length of the arrows are going to be exactly where I want them to be. So if you can't push or twist your nocks in all the way with just your hand, if you've got a nock tool, you can use that to push the nock into the shaft. But another good way to do it is to just take your bow and the serving on the string, and you can press the nock into that. Set this bow on the table. And you can just press the arrow into the nock on the string. never, ever take the nock and press it onto the table. You will bend the nock and you will not be able to really see it, but you will make that plastic more nimble and easier to break. And when you shoot, if that nock breaks, you could derail your string or your bow, break your string, etc. We don't want those problems, and we want the nocks to be as straight and consistent as possible. So use a nock tool or just push it in off of the string. So now that we have all of our nocks in on the side that we just cut, we need to now cut the other end of the shaft. So I'm going to adjust the saw. We went from 29.5 here. I've got a mark on here. This is about for a 27.5 inch arrow. So I'm just going to move this to there. I know on the scale here it reads just under 28, but from the throat of the nock right here to the end of the shaft, that comes out to be about 27.5 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and now I'm going to cut this other end of these shafts. So now that we've got both ends of our arrow cut, the shafts are at our final length that we want it at. For me, this is 27.5 inches. Okay, so now we can, if we want, we can actually double check to test how much straighter the arrows are. And if I spin these on the spinner, I can see that both ends, I mean, there's almost no wobble at all. Now granted, I'm taking over a 32 inch arrow and cutting it to 27.5, so I've got a lot of room to get rid of that wobble. But still, if you're shooting a 29 or even 30 inch arrow, you can take a lot of that wobble out by cutting it off of each end of the shaft. So now that we've cut our shafts, what I like to do is take a tool like this. This is just a G5 brand. I know there's some others, but this is basically an arrow squaring tool. So it's going to square the ends that we just cut. So I know that we just put the nocks in to get our perfect arrow length. I do want to do this off of both ends, so I will remove the nocks, but for now I'm going to do the end I just cut. I'll just place it right here in the arrow square, press down on it, and I just spin it against that sandpaper. And what it does is it squares that end of the arrow so that it's perfectly 90 degrees to the shaft. That way the point and the nock from each end will seat perfectly against the shaft so that it is consistent as possible. So if you followed along to this point, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, this is great, but I really don't want to shoot arrows with labels in different areas and on different parts of the shaft. So the next part that I do most of the time with my setup is I'll take some kind of steel wool like this. I believe this is actually just copper steel wool, and I will scrape the label off of the shaft. You got to be very careful when you do this because you don't want to be abrasive towards the carbon, but you do want to take off basically that label that is just inked onto the carbon. So I can take this, and it's firm but not super tight, and I'll just run it back and forth, and it slowly but surely removes the label. You can also take acetone to help soften the label, and that'll wipe right off with that as well. But this is an easy process to do as well. And then there you go. Label is gone. So I can do that for all 12 of the arrows. There will be no label on it whatsoever. So if that's a big deal for you, you don't have to take this step. But if you do want the straightest arrows possible, I highly recommend it. So now that you've cut all of your shafts and you've wiped the labels off, you're going to have some carbon residue on all the shafts. So it is a good idea to just take a damp paper towel and just wipe them all down on the inside or the outside. And then we will actually take a Q-tip and we'll just get it a little bit wet to clean out the inside, because the next portion is going to be installing the inserts. So I'll just get it wet, stick it inside, and I pull it out, and you can see how dirty that is. So we want to get it as clean as we can. That way we don't have all of the carbon on our hands, and the inserts will stick extremely well. So at this point, before we start putting in the inserts and stuff like that, I just want to double check the straightness of our arrows. So I'll take the fully cut shaft, this is with the label off after we cleaned it, everything else, and I will just spin it on the spinner. And what I'm looking for is if there is any kind of wobble at all left in the shaft, that is the end that I want the insert to go into. I want the straightest end of the shaft to always have the nock end in it. So the shaft is good. I'm just going to go down this line and make sure that the nock is in the straightest end of the arrow. Okay, all of these are set. The next step that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take each one of these shafts, and I'm just gonna take a Sharpie, and I'm gonna write numbers from 1 to 12 on this dozen of arrows. That way I've got a way to keep track of the arrows. It's not uncommon for any brand or any manufacturer of arrow to have 1 or 2 out of a dozen that just does not fly right or with the rest of the shafts. So I want to be able to identify those arrows. If I'm always getting one flyer and it's always the same arrow, chances are it's probably the arrow and not the bow or the shooter. So I want to be able to identify that, and having those arrows or the numbers on the arrows can help me identify that. So we're just going to number those right here on the end of the carbon. So our next step for building our arrows is going to be installing our inserts. Now, just like long distance rifle shooting, we want the least standard deviation from each arrow possible. We've already done this with the straightness by cutting from both ends to get the arrows as straight as possible from cutting out the wobble, but now we need to do it with weight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each one of these dozen arrows, I'm going to weigh them, and I will put them in order from lightest to heaviest. Then I will take the weight of each insert and list them from lightest to heaviest as well. From that point, I will take the heaviest insert and the lightest arrow, and those two will be the ones that go together. And then I go all the way down the line so that the lightest arrow has the heaviest insert and the heaviest arrow has the lightest insert. That way we can ultimately get the least amount of deviation in arrow weight possible. This is very, very important for any long distance shooting. Just even a few grains at 80, 90, 100 yards can throw your arrow off quite a few inches. So if you really want to be very precise with your arrow build, you've got to get your arrow weight as consistent as possible among all dozen shafts. So the lightest arrow is 300.8 grains. The heaviest arrow is 302.8 grains. So there is roughly a 2 grain variance between these dozen arrows. So we're hoping by being able to do this process with the inserts, with the points, and with the fletchings, we can take that deviation of 2 grains and narrow it down so that it's even less than that. But the next thing we're going to do is do it with our field points, because there might be some more variation between our field points. We're going to do the exact same thing, weigh them lightest to heaviest. That way we can combine them with the lightest and the heaviest arrows and the lightest and the heaviest points so that there's the least deviation possible. So to install the inserts on the Easton Axis arrows, I love to use this 2-part epoxy that they include. It is a slow drying glue, but it secures the insert in the arrow extremely, extremely well. And by having that strength of that insert bonded on the inside of that carbon shaft, it really makes the whole system that much stronger. So to use this, I just push all the glue down in the bottom, cut off the corner, and then I will push this on the packaging that the inserts were in. So they're kind of mixed together, and I just take a Q-tip and I just break off one end, and I will use this to stir the epoxy together. So now I'm mixing the 2-part epoxy so that it can bind together, and it will take the full 24 hours for it to really set up and harden in the shaft, but that is also what makes it so strong. So we've got our glue mixed up here. So again, I will take the lightest arrow, which is 300.8 grains. I will take the heaviest insert, which is 16.8 grains. Obviously make sure you're putting the insert in the right direction. I will take a very subtle piece of glue, so just very little. You do not need a lot. So I put just barely a little bit on, put it right in the end of the shaft, and I'm going to slowly spin it to cover all sides. And as I do that, I'm going to push it all the way into the shaft. So I've got it just so there's barely a lip, and I'll take my paper towel and I'll rub off any excess glue on the outside. Now I'll take the green insert tool that comes with the inserts and the bags. I'll just take the plunger, line it up with the insert, push it all the way in, pull it out, and that insert is set. So I just wipe off the glue on the end, And now I lay this down. Now I'm going to lay these arrows in order so that I can match them with the points that are needed. So the lightest arrow with the heaviest insert will be on the right. So I'll also need to include the heaviest point. So once those inserts dry, that is when I will include the heavier point with that lightest arrow and the heaviest insert. So if you're really in a pinch and you need the arrows to shoot like right now, or if you're shooting other arrows that you don't use the two-part epoxy, you just want to use a standard glue, I like to use hotmelt. Hotmelt works extremely fast, it is very secure, and you can actually take the inserts and the points out if you need to. So to do this with the hit inserts, what I'll do is I will take one of the lighter arrows, one of the heavier inserts, and one of the heavier points, and I'll actually screw the point into the insert itself. Okay. And then what I like to do, I've seen this done multiple ways. Some people heat up the insert itself. I personally heat up the glue. So I will heat up the glue with a lighter. This is kind of a torch lighter, so it lights it pretty hot, which is helpful for the hot melt because it can take quite a bit to get it to melt good. So we're not burning it, we're just melting it. So I've got a good amount melted there. And I'll put quite a bit down the side of the insert. So as you can see, there is a lot of glue on that insert, which is a good thing. There is going to be extra come off, so not a problem there. So now that we've got the glue on here, it does cool very fast. So now I'll take the lighter, the torch, and I'll go over the glue, and I'm just going to make sure that it's all soft so that I can apply it into the arrow shaft. If it's too hard, it's not going to work because it's not going to bind with the actual arrow in the carbon. Okay, so that's good and hot. We want it good and hot, but not dripping off the shaft if possible. Okay, so I take my carbon shaft, push it in, and I'm twisting and pulling it in and out as I put this in. And then once I get close, I can take it, push it all the way down, just like that. So if you look at it, I've got a really nice ring of the glue at the end of the shaft. That is completely fine. Leave it until it dries and it's cool. And once it's cool, we can just take the end of our hand and roll that right off the end of the arrow. And then you're good to go. If you needed to pull out this point, you could just heat up the actual point itself, not the carbon. Heat up the point with the lighter, grab onto it with a pair of pliers, not your fingers, and pull it right back out. And then you're good to go. Now, I do not recommend using the hot melt process with the hit inserts for hunting arrows, because like I said earlier, that two-part epoxy and having that secured so extremely well inside the carbon shaft, it adds a lot of strength to it. So since these arrows, these other 6 are just going to be the target shaft arrows, I'm just going to glue them with hot melt. That way we can get to shooting them this afternoon. So now we are almost ready to fletch our arrows. But before we fletch our arrows, we have to figure out the orientation of how our arrow naturally spins out of the bow. This is referred to as arrow clocking. You've probably heard of it, but without fletchings, just a bare shaft shot out of your bow, the arrow will naturally rotate either clockwise or counterclockwise out of your bow. Now, I encourage everybody to test this before fletching so that you can determine left or right helical, but as a general rule of thumb, this is what I've found. For a right-handed shooter with a clockwise to tighten string, you generally have a bare shaft that comes out of your bow counterclockwise. This would indicate a left helical for that arrow. Now, on a right-handed bow with a counterclockwise twist to tighten string, the opposite is true. I've noticed the bare shafts to most generally clock clockwise out of the bow, indicating a right helical on your arrow. So again, that is very basic. I know that that is not always the case, and serving direction can also have an effect on which way that bare shaft comes out. So what we're going to do, we're going to grab these arrows that we just glued up with the hot melt and the field points. We're going to head down to the range, and we are going to shoot these arrows to figure out which way they are clocking out of the bow. So we're at the range. I've got one of the bare shafts knocked on the bow. As you can see, I've got it so that the numbers are marked right on the top of the shaft. That way when we shoot it into the target, we can see which way the arrow's turning. So we're just here, we're really close to a target, just 3, 4, 5 feet away. I'm gonna draw back and shoot. Okay, so let's come up and take a look. So as we can see, the numbers went from the top to the left side. So that arrow is spinning counterclockwise out of the bow. So we're gonna go back. I'm just gonna take one more step back here, see if I can get this arrow to spin even just a little bit more by shooting it a little bit further, just to confirm that that's the direction that it is spinning. So we'll draw back, shoot one more here. Okay. So now the numbers are all the way on the bottom side of the arrow. So that went all the way from the top, spun counterclockwise, all the way to the bottom. So this bare shaft and this bow with these strings, the arrow is spinning counterclockwise out of the bow. This is going to indicate that we need to fletch with a left helical. If we fletch with a right helical, that's still okay. It'll still fly all right, but it is contradicting the natural rotation of the arrow out of the bow. To just get so that it's not fighting the arrow in the natural rotation, we just want the fletching orientation to align with the direction that the shaft is spinning. So with the spinning counterclockwise, we're going to fletch it counterclockwise, which is left helical. So I always like to double check my bare shaft tune with my fletched arrows, and how I do it is I just shoot the fletched arrows at 20 yards and I shoot the bare shafts at 20 yards. I do not shoot the bare shafts through paper. I'm just looking at where the bare shafts are impacting and their angle relative to my fletched arrows. So I've already shot a couple bare shafts down there. I'm going to shoot one more and then a fletched arrow, and we will go take a look. Okay, we'll shoot one fletched arrow. Okay, let's go down and take a look. All right, so fairly consistent. As you can see, I mean, we're shooting a bag target, so the angle is not the best per se. They are all grouping together, but it looks like the bare shafts might be at a slight tail high angle. So what that is most likely telling me is that my string and cables have slightly stretched some. So I probably got to recheck my cam sync, and half a twist and one of the cables will probably clear that right up. So this is good enough for now. We know the bow is tuned. So once we fletch our arrows and we go into the arrow tuning process, then that'll make that process so much easier. So let's head back home. We will fletch these arrows and we'll go from there. Okay, so now that we are ready to fletch, the first thing I'm actually going to do is install arrow wraps. So what I like to do is I like to take the length of my vane, which is an AAE Max Stealth, and I like to cut the wrap so that it is just slightly longer than the actual vane. So the vane is 2.6 inches. This wrap is probably 2.7, 2.75. I will cut these wraps. These are just a reflective wrap. I will cut them down so that they're at that length, and then I will mark it on the arrow where it will be fletched, and then that's where I will put the wrap. So it's always a good idea to have a book like this that you can roll the wraps onto. So I will take an already finished arrow, and I'm going to line up the end of where the nock connects on the shaft and see where that actual wrap starts. So I'll just take a piece of this masking tape, doesn't have to be very big, and that is going to be where I line the wrap up. Okay. So I just double check that the spacing is correct, because again, when I put that wrap on there, I'm going to have that gap on the end. I'm only putting that wrap to cover where the fletching goes. Main purpose that I do that for is it just makes it easier to refletch the arrows if I ever need to refletch, if I shoot holes through them or tear them off or anything like that. It's way easier to scrape that wrap off than it is to scrape the glue and the fletching off of the actual carbon arrow. So I just went over that portion. You can just put the full length wrap on, that is completely fine. This is just what I like to do. So I've got my gap set. So I will take these wraps and I will just peel one off. I've already cut these to length. And I will just line it up with the very edge of the tape. Then I will take the arrow, line up the edge of the carbon on the very edge of the book, and I roll it down right to the edge of the wrap. Press down, roll it to the edge, just make sure that that edge is good and firm against the arrow, and just roll it out the rest of the way. And so then I can just check that seam to make sure it's good all the way down, and now I've got a perfectly wrapped arrow. So I will do that for all 6 of these shafts, and then we'll fletch right on top of them. Okay, now that we've got our arrow wraps onto our arrows here, I'm just going to do these 6 while these other ones dry. Now we are ready to fletch. But after putting the inserts and the points in these arrows, we still have some variance between the arrows. So some are a little bit lighter, some are a little bit heavier. Thankfully, there is a little bit of variance between the weight of the vanes. So what we're going to do the exact same process as what we did with the inserts and with the points. We're just going to lay another piece of tape out right here on the table, and we are going to sort our fletchings. So these fletchings, first one weighs 8.2. They should be pretty consistent, but if each fletching has a variance of 0.2 grains and you put 3 fletchings on an arrow, that's 0.6 grains of variation. So 8.2, 8.4, 8.6. So right there already we've got 8.2, 8.4, 8.6. That's already quite a bit of variation in the fletchings themselves. And again, when we have 3 fletchings on an arrow, if we put all light fletchings on or all heavy fletchings on, that can be several grains of a difference between each arrows. So we want to ensure that we mark all these fletchings accordingly with their weight, and we want to make sure that we put the heavy fletchings with the light arrows and the light fletchings with the heavy arrows. That way we can get that deviation between our arrows to be less than 1 grain total. So I'm going to go through all these fletchings, not all of them, but I'll go through 18 of them, just so we got 3 for each arrow on these 6, and I will sort them out by weight, and then we will determine which fletchings need to go with what arrow so that we can have the least amount of deviation possible. So between our lightest and our heaviest arrow is roughly 1.2 grains total, and between our fletchings it's 8.2 to 8.8. So we've still got a little bit of variance here. So what I'm going to test, just to make this simple math, is I'm going to take the heaviest arrow and I'm going to take the lightest fletchings and I'm going to put that combination together, and then I'm going to take the lightest arrow and the heaviest fletchings and put that combination together and see how much variance we get between the two. So lightest fletchings, 8.2 times 3 is 24.6, 24.6 plus 425.4 is right at 450 for the heavy arrow with the light fletchings. Now if we take the light arrow, which is 424.2, and we'll just do the 8.6 fletchings, so 8.6 times 3 plus 424.2, we get a total weight of 450. So this light shaft and these heavy shafts, if we fletch with that process, they will weigh almost exactly the same. Now glue obviously has a little bit of weight into it, so it might be a little bit off, but all of these arrows will be within 1 grain when we're finished. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to fletch the light arrow with the heavy fletchings and the heavy arrow with the light fletchings. All right, so did the math, and we've got it so that with all the fletchings we've got here and the arrows, each arrow should weigh exactly 450 grains. Obviously, the glue does have weight to it, So the final product will most likely not be exactly 450 grains, but I know that it will be within 1 grain variance, and that is going to have a huge impact on our groups downrange. So I'll start with the jig. I've got the left helical clamp because we determined that our arrow clocks counterclockwise, and we do not want to fight that clocking. We want our arrows to naturally go with it. So left helical will go along with that arrow. We'll go ahead and we will start with the light shafts, which 424.2. I'll go ahead and I will put this in the Bitzenberger fletching jig. I've already got my jig all set up so that my fletchings can fit in here perfectly. To get to 450 grains, which is what I was able to get all the arrows to, I need 3 8.6 grain vanes. So I'll mount the vane in the clamp just like this, and I always put it at that farthest or the closest position. I don't have issues with the fletchings contacting my face, and so by having the fletchings on the back end of the arrow, you actually get slightly more steering power since they're closer to the back end. If they're further forward, you get less steering power, but you may need to do that if you are getting fletching contact on your face, if you've got a beard or just anchor harder into your face. So then I will take the AAE pin. This is just the Max Weld primer pin, and I do this one at a time. I do not go through and do all the fletchings. I do one fletching at a time, and I push down, and then I get that whole fletching wet with this primer pin. Okay, and then I take my glue. This is a brand new bottle of glue. I just took it out of the package. One thing to note about not only the Max Bond glue, but any glue that you use, glue does have an expiration date. This glue is best used by September of this year. And if you are having problems with your fletching sticking, first thing to check is your glue and make sure that it's not expired. So this is good to go, but I've done it with expired glue in the past and I've had not so good results. So make sure you check that. Okay, so our glue should be opened up with the end cap here. Now when I apply glue to the fletchings, it does not take a lot. So I do almost as thin of a bead as possible, all the way down the fletching. More is not better in this application. And then I will align it so the back of the clamp is right on the Bitzenberger. Press down, and I just slowly press it right onto the arrow. And the fletching is fitting onto the wrap perfectly. I just press and I hold it firmly with the clamp for 15 seconds. And then once I've held it there long enough with that firm pressure, I just undo the clamp and I just give it one click. Now I will do this for all 3 fletchings on each arrow, and I will do it until it's done. And when I am done with that, I am done with the fletching process. You will not be able to pull them apart. You do not need to add glue on the tips. If you do it just like this, it'll be secure. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to fletch all the rest of these arrows, get all 6 of these fletched up, and then we've got one more part of our arrow build process that will make our arrows as forgiving as possible, and that's arrow tuning. So with an already well-tuned bow, this next process is relatively simple. If your bow is not already tuned, I recommend just holding back roughly half of your arrows before fletching to keeping the other half as bareshaft so that you can bareshaft tune before accomplishing this arrow tuning process. So basically, by following this arrow tuning process, you can completely eliminate the need for a spine tester, which can be very expensive. Your average archer like me or most bow hunters are not going to have one or not going to want to spend the several $100s on one. And I honestly believe that by following this process, you can achieve the same results or actually achieve better results because they're actually shot-based results rather than just going off of a spine tester in the first place. So what it is that we're going to do is we're going to take our arrows. I've just got the 6 that we fletched with the hotmelt for the insert and the points. We're going to line them up and shoot them down a line through the paper, and we're going to look at each paper tear. Now we had a bareshaft tuned before, so we know that these arrows are coming out straight. So of the 6 that I shoot through the paper, there should be several that already have a perfect bullet hole through the paper. So we're going to eliminate those arrows because those are already tuned perfect. But the ones that have a slight tear one direction or another, we're just going to take our arrow and we're going to rotate it on our string to the next fletching. and then we're going to shoot again. We're going to see if we can get those ones with a slight tear one direction or another to get a perfect tear by slightly rotating that nocking position. I'll go ahead, line up, and I'll shoot all 6 arrows in a line down this paper. Okay, so let's take a real close look at these tears here. Set my bow down. Okay, so what we're looking for is any kind of inconsistencies. So this first one looks like a perfect bullet hole. So this arrow here, which we look around the back side of the target, this first arrow is set. We do not have to adjust that one. So I'll just go ahead and pull it out, put it back in my quiver. If we look at this second one, it looks like it might be a slightly high right tear. Next one, kind of a rough tear, but maybe a little bit high right as well. This one is looking somewhat similar along with this one. And then this last one is kind of a rough tear, but we're going to shoot that one again as well. So we're going to rotate the nock on all of these arrows other than the one, and we will shoot them again. Okay, so this is our second round of shooting. So I've got all those arrows in a line from down below. So I'm just going to rotate the arrow to the next fletching in line, and I will shoot it again. So I'm going to do that for each one of these arrows, shoot it again, and see which ones I can get to bullet hole. Okay, so now this is our second round of shooting. So you can see this arrow after we turned it, much cleaner tear. So we'll pull that one out. This one looks like it's maybe just slightly high, and so does this one. This one, we're going to call that good enough because it doesn't look like it is tearing high right like it was. And now this one is tearing slightly high right. So we're going to pull the first one and the fourth one. Okay, so now we've got these 3 to go. Third round. I'm going to rotate it one more time. So we shot all 3 of these through. And if you look, it looks like almost every single tear is slightly high. So what I'm guessing that's from is I did stand maybe a step or 2 back that time. And if you remember when we shot the bareshafts down range, they were impacting with the fletched arrow, but that nock end was kicked up quite a bit. So it is likely that my strings and cables with the heat this summer have probably stretched a little bit. So I probably do have to put the cams in sync. That'll probably fix that top tear. So we just bumped up the rest just a little bit. We don't have our bow press handy with us. So we moved that rest up just a touch to compensate for that higher tear. So we're just going to shoot all 6 of these arrows through the paper again and see what kind of tears we're getting. Okay. If you take a look, they are all just barely a touch high, but they are all consistent, all 6 of them. So we did move the rest up a little bit, hoping to fix it, but now we are still getting consistent tears all the way across the board with all 6 arrows. That's proving the consistency across the arrows. So once we do have access to a press and we are able to twist that 1/2 twist in a cable, those arrows should be bullet holing perfectly. Once you have completed this process, you know that you have built arrows that will fly perfectly straight out of your bow and out of your setup. You don't need to do every single step out of this process. You can simply just put the regular inserts in, put the points in, fletch your arrows. That is completely fine. But if you want to achieve the most out of your arrows and have the least weight variance possible, follow this process step by step, and you will build the most accurate arrows for your setup. If you do have some interest in learning how to set up and tune your own bow, be sure to visit our Ultimate Bow Build Masterclass online course linked in the description below. Thank you guys for following along in this video, and I hope you found it helpful.